Before we dive into Hades' story, we need to understand the world he was born into. Ancient Greece wasn't just one unified culture, it was a collection of city-states, each with their own traditions, but all sharing core myths that explained everything from why seasons change to why people die. The gods weren't distant, abstract beings. They were personalities with flaws, desires, and conflicts, and among all these divine beings, Hades occupied a unique position, necessary, powerful, but deliberately kept at arm's length. His story begins not in darkness, but with his birth into a family destined to rule the cosmos. Long before Zeus ruled Olympus, long before humans walked the earth, the world was governed by beings called Titans. These were the children of Gaia, the earth herself, and Uranus, the sky. The Titans were immense, primordial forces who ruled during what the Greeks called the Golden Age. Among them was Cronus, the youngest and most ambitious. With the help of his mother Gaia, Cronus overthrew his father Uranus using a sickle made of adamantine, the hardest substance in existence. This brutal act gave Cronus the throne, but it also planted the seeds of his eventual downfall. After seizing power, Cronus married his sister Rhea, as was common among the Titans. But his mother Gaia, who had helped him overthrow Uranus, now delivered a chilling prophecy. Just as Cronus had overthrown his father, so too would he be overthrown by one of his own children. This prophecy haunted Cronus every waking moment. Unlike his father, who had merely imprisoned his children, Cronus decided on a more drastic solution. He would not let any of his offspring grow strong enough to challenge him. He would swallow them whole at birth, keeping them alive but trapped within his own body, unable to grow, unable to threaten him. When Rhea gave birth to her first child, she felt both joy and terror. She named him Hades, a name that would later be associated with his realm, but originally may have meant the unseen one. The moment was brief. Before Rhea could even hold her newborn son properly, Cronus appeared, snatched the infant from her arms, and swallowed him whole. Hades found himself not dead, but trapped in an impossible darkness, conscious but imprisoned within his father's stomach. This would be his existence for years, joined eventually by 4 more siblings: Hestia, Demeter, Hera, and Poseidon. They existed in a strange limbo, neither alive nor dead, aging slowly in their prison. What was it like inside Cronus? The ancient texts don't provide many details, but we can imagine the horror. Hades and his siblings existed in a pocket dimension within their father's body, a dark, confined space where time moved differently. They were aware, perhaps even able to communicate with each other, but utterly powerless. Hades, as the firstborn of this generation, spent the longest time in this prison. While his father ruled the world above, Hades grew in darkness, his personality shaped by isolation and helplessness. This experience would later influence how he ruled his own realm, with absolute control, ensuring no one could ever trap or overpower him again. Eventually, Rhea could bear the suffering no longer. When she became pregnant for the 6th time, she devised a desperate plan with the help of Gaia. After giving birth to Zeus in a cave on the island of Crete, far from Cronus's palace, Rhea wrapped a large stone in swaddling clothes. When Cronus came to claim this child, Rhea handed him the bundle. The Titan king, so paranoid and rushed, didn't even look closely. He swallowed the stone in one gulp, believing he had consumed another potential threat. Meanwhile, Zeus was hidden away, raised by nymphs and fed on honey and the milk of the goat Amalthea, growing strong and free. Years later, Zeus returned as a young adult god, powerful and determined. With the help of the Oceanid Metis, he prepared a powerful emetic poison. Disguised as a cupbearer, Zeus served this potion to his father. The effect was immediate and violent. Cronus's body convulsed and he began to vomit. First came the stone, then one by one, Zeus's siblings emerged. fully grown gods, preserved somehow during their imprisonment. Poseidon came forth, then Hera, then Demeter and Hestia, and finally Hades, the eldest, who had spent the longest time in that dark prison. They stood before their father, no longer helpless infants but powerful Olympians, ready to reclaim their birthright. The moment of liberation was both joyous and terrible. The 6 Olympian siblings stood together for the first time, facing their father who had imprisoned them. There would be no reconciliation, no peaceful transition of power. Cronus immediately called upon his Titan siblings, Oceanus, Hyperion, Iapetus, Caius, Crius, and others. These ancient beings were not about to surrender the cosmos to upstart children. Thus began the Titanomachy, a war that would reshape reality itself. The conflict would rage for 10 full years, shaking the foundations of heaven and earth. Hades, emerging from darkness into this cosmic war, found purpose in battle, a way to reclaim not just freedom, but dignity. Early in the war, Zeus made a crucial strategic decision. Deep in the darkest pit of Tartarus, imprisoned by Cronus, just as Uranus had imprisoned them before, were the Cyclopes, 3 enormous one-eyed beings who were master craftsmen beyond compare. Zeus descended into Tartarus, braving its horrors, and freed them. In gratitude, the Cyclopes forged 3 legendary weapons. For Zeus, the thunderbolt that could split mountains. For Poseidon, a trident that could command earthquakes and tsunamis. And for Hades, they forged something different, not a weapon of destruction, but one of stealth and strategy. The Helm of Darkness, a crown that rendered its wearer completely invisible and undetectable. While Zeus became known for his thunderous assaults, and Poseidon for his earth-shaking charges, Hades developed a different reputation on the battlefield. With the Helm of Darkness upon his head, he became a phantom warrior, unseen, unpredictable, and terrifying. Ancient texts describe how Titans would suddenly find their weapons destroyed, their commanders vanished, their supply lines severed, all without seeing their attacker. Hades moved through enemy camps like a whisper, gathering intelligence, sabotaging defenses, and striking at critical moments. He embodied the inevitability of death itself. You couldn't see it coming, couldn't fight what you couldn't perceive. And when it struck, there was no escape. As the war dragged on with neither side gaining decisive advantage, Zeus made another fateful decision. Even deeper than the Cyclopes in Tartarus were imprisoned the Hecatoncheires, 3 brothers named Cottus, Briareus, and Gyges, each with 100 arms and 50 heads. These were beings of pure destructive power, so terrifying that even the Titans had sealed them away. Zeus descended once more into the abyss and freed them, promising them honor and freedom if they fought for the Olympians. The Hecatoncheires agreed, and their entry into the war was catastrophic for the Titans. Each could hurl hundreds of boulders simultaneously, creating storms of projectiles that no army could withstand. The climactic battle of the Titanomachy took place on the plains of Thessaly, where heaven and earth seemed to collide. Zeus unleashed endless thunderbolts that scorched the ground and split the sky. Poseidon summoned earthquakes and tidal waves that reshaped coastlines. The Hecatoncheires created a siege of stone and fury, and through it all Hades moved unseen, eliminating key Titan commanders and sowing chaos in their ranks. The earth itself groaned under the weight of divine conflict. Mountains crumbled, rivers ran dry, and the very fabric of reality trembled. Finally, after 10 years of warfare, the Titans' lines broke. One by one they were subdued and bound in chains forged by the Cyclopes, unbreakable adamantine chains. Victory achieved, the question became what to do with the defeated Titans. Zeus decreed they would be imprisoned in Tartarus, that deepest abyss below even Hades' future realm. It wasn't just a prison, but a dimension of suffering, surrounded by bronze walls and gates. The Hecatoncheires, in gratitude for their freedom, agreed to serve as eternal guards, ensuring no Titan could ever escape. As the defeated Titans were marched down into the darkness, Hades watched with particular attention. He understood imprisonment better than any of his siblings. He had lived it, and he recognized that proper governance required not just power, but the ability to maintain boundaries, to keep things where they belonged. This lesson would define his future rule. With the Titans defeated and imprisoned, the 6 Olympian siblings faced a new challenge: how to govern the cosmos they had won. Zeus, as the youngest who had orchestrated their freedom and led them to victory, naturally assumed leadership. But Poseidon and Hades were also powerful gods who had contributed immensely to the victory. The cosmos was vast. It needed to be divided. But how do you divide infinity fairly? How do you prevent the resentment and rivalry that could spark another war? The ancient texts tell us they made a choice that seems strange to modern ears. They decided their fates through random chance. They would cast lots, trusting to fate itself to determine who ruled what. The lots were cast. Zeus drew the sky and the heavens. He would be king of the gods, ruler of the upper air where storms and weather dwell, the realm closest to divine power. Poseidon drew the seas. All oceans, rivers and waters would be his domain, the source of life and the highway of the world. And Hades drew the underworld, the vast realm beneath the earth where all mortal souls journey after death, the caverns and minerals and hidden places. Some myths suggest Hades drew the shortest lot, implying he got the worst realm. But this misunderstands ancient Greek thought. Each realm was essential, necessary, and powerful. Without death, life has no meaning. Without the underworld, the natural cycle cannot complete. Crucially, the division didn't give each god exclusive domain over everything. The earth itself, the surface world where mortals would eventually thrive, remained common to all 3 brothers. Mount Olympus, the home of the gods, was shared territory. This meant that while Hades ruled the underworld absolutely, he was still an Olympian with the right to attend councils and influence the world above. However, ancient texts make it clear that Hades rarely exercised this right. Unlike Zeus, who constantly meddled in mortal affairs, or Poseidon, who frequently visited his domain's surface waters, Hades remained in his realm. Not because he was banished, but because he understood something profound. A ruler must be present in his kingdom. Some later myths portray Hades as resentful of his lot, angry at being stuck in the gloomy underworld while his brothers got more glamorous domains. But this seems to be a later invention. The earliest sources suggest Hades accepted his role with dignity and perhaps even satisfaction. Consider what the underworld offered: absolute authority. In the sky, Zeus had to manage quarrelsome gods and compete with other sky deities from different pantheons. In the sea, Poseidon dealt with ancient oceanic spirits and primordial water beings who resisted his rule. But in the underworld, the Hades was supreme. No god challenged his authority there. Even Zeus, king of the gods, couldn't reverse Hades' decisions about the dead. For someone who had spent his youth utterly powerless, this absolute sovereignty must have been deeply appealing. The Greek underworld, Hades' domain, was not a single location, but a complex geography of regions, each serving different purposes. It began at the boundaries of the mortal world, where rivers marked the threshold, 5 rivers in total, each with symbolic meaning. The Styx, river of hatred and oaths; the Acheron, river of woe; the Lethe, river of forgetfulness whose waters erased mortal memories; the Phlegethon, river of fire; and the Cocytus, river of lamentation. These weren't mere metaphors, but actual geographical features in Greek thought, creating barriers that separated the living world from the realm of the dead. Crossing them meant leaving behind everything that defined mortal existence. At the banks of the Acheron waited Charon, the skeletal ferryman whose ancient boat transported souls across the river to the underworld proper. Charon was not under Hades' command, but rather a primordial entity who predated even the Olympians. Performing his duty since the beginning of death itself, he demanded payment, a coin called an obol, placed on the tongue or eyes of the deceased during burial. Those who couldn't pay were doomed to wander the shores for 100 years. This detail reveals something important about Greek culture. They understood death as having rules, procedures, and costs. Even in death, social obligations continued. Proper burial wasn't just about respect, it was a practical necessity for the soul's journey. Once across the river, souls encountered Cerberus, the famous three-headed hound who guarded the gates of Hades' realm. But Cerberus wasn't what people usually think. He didn't keep souls out, he kept them in. His job was to prevent the dead from escaping back to the living world. Each of his 3 heads watched a different direction, ensuring no soul could sneak past. He allowed the newly dead to enter freely, but would attack viciously any who tried to leave. Various living heroes would eventually face Cerberus, Heracles, Orpheus, and Aeneas among them, and each encounter demonstrated the hound's terrifying but purposeful nature. Cerberus was the physical manifestation of death's one-way door. Beyond Cerberus lay the largest region of the underworld, the Asphodel Meadows. This is where the vast majority of souls spent eternity. It wasn't punishment or reward, but rather neutral existence. The souls here were like shadows or faded photographs of their former selves, maintaining their shape and memories, but lacking substance and vitality. They wandered through grey fields of asphodel flowers, pale, ghostly plants in Greek mythology, in a state between consciousness and sleep. They could communicate with each other, remember their lives, but experience nothing new. Homer described them as shades or ghosts, diminished versions of their living selves. This reveals what Greeks feared most about death, not torture, but insignificance and fading. Not all souls went directly to Asphodel. Upon arrival in the underworld, each soul was judged by 3 legendary figures, Minos, Rhadamanthus, and Iacchus. These were men so renowned for their wisdom and fairness in life that after death, Hades appointed them as judges. They would listen to the soul's life story, weigh their deeds, and determine their eternal placement. Minos judged Europeans, Rhadamanthus judged Asians, and Iacchus judged Greeks. Though some sources give them different specializations, their judgments were final and binding. This judicial system shows that Greeks didn't believe death was random or chaotic. There was order, process, and justice, overseen ultimately by Hades, who ensured the judges remained impartial. Beneath even the normal underworld lay Tartarus, a place of active punishment for the worst offenders. This was where Zeus had imprisoned the Titans, but it also held mortal souls, whose crimes were so terrible they earned eternal torment. Tantalus, who served his own son as food to the gods, stood in a pool that receded whenever he tried to drink, beneath fruit trees whose branches lifted whenever he reached for them, eternal hunger and thirst. Sisyphus, who cheated death itself, endlessly rolled a boulder up a hill only to have it roll back down. Ixion, who tried to seduce Hera, was bound to a flaming wheel that spun forever. These weren't random tortures, but symbolic punishments reflecting their crimes. Hades rarely intervened here. These souls had been judged by the system and received their due. On the opposite extreme was Elysium, or the Elysian Fields, a paradise reserved for heroes, demigods, and those especially favored by the gods. Here, souls lived in eternal spring and joy, engaging in sports, music, feasting, all the pleasures of life without pain or death. The fields were always green, the weather always perfect, and there was no work or struggle. Some sources place Elysium within Hades' realm, others make it a separate domain altogether at the edge of the world. Those lucky enough to reach Elysium could even choose to be reborn into the living world, though only after being purified in the Lethe and forgetting their past lives. This showed the Greeks believed exceptional virtue could transcend even death's grey monotony. At the center of his realm stood Hades' palace, a magnificent structure carved from the living rock of the underworld itself. Its walls were made of precious metals and gems found deep in the earth, gold, silver, adamantine, and stones that glowed with their own internal light. The throne room was vast, with columns that reached into darkness and floors of polished obsidian. The throne itself was black stone, inlaid with skulls, not as a sign of evil but as symbols of his authority over death. Here, Hades sat in judgment, managed the operation of his realm, and received the rare visitors brave or foolish enough to seek an audience with the Lord of Death. It was not a place of torture or despair, but of somber dignity and absolute authority. For ages after receiving his domain, Hades ruled alone. While Zeus took numerous wives and lovers, while Poseidon married Amphitrite, Hades remained solitary in his vast underground kingdom. This wasn't because he was incapable of love or undesirable. Gods and mortals alike feared and respected him, but his realm presented unique challenges for companionship. Who would want to leave the sunshine, flowers, and life of the upper world to dwell eternally in the land of the dead? The answer, as it turned out, would be no one who came willingly. This reality would eventually drive Hades to a controversial decision that would change the seasons themselves and reveal both his capacity for love and his willingness to act ruthlessly when necessary. Meanwhile, in the world above, Demeter, goddess of agriculture and harvest, had a daughter named Persephone, sometimes called Kor, meaning maiden. Persephone was everything the underworld was not: young, vibrant, joyful, and closely associated with spring flowers and new growth. She spent her days gathering flowers with nymphs in the meadows of Sicily, dancing, laughing, bringing life wherever she went. She was Demeter's joy and the embodiment of spring itself. The ancient texts describe her beauty and innocence in detail, emphasizing her connection to the surface world, to light, and to the cycles of growth. She represented everything living and young, the complete opposite of Hades' realm. Perhaps that contrast was exactly what drew his attention. One day, Persephone wandered slightly away from her companions, drawn by a flower unlike any she had seen before, a magnificent narcissus with 100 blooms. Unknown to her, this flower had been specifically planted by Zeus, some versions say by Gaia herself, as part of a plan. Zeus had agreed to help his brother Hades, who had asked permission to marry Persephone. But both gods knew Demeter would never consent, and Persephone herself might refuse out of duty to her mother or fear of the underworld. So Zeus created a trap, a flower so beautiful and unusual that Persephone couldn't resist reaching for it. As she bent to pluck the narcissus, the earth beneath her feet began to tremble. She had triggered something irreversible. The earth split open with a deafening roar. From the chasm emerged a chariot pulled by 4 immortal black horses, and driving it was Hades himself, appearing in the mortal world for the first time in ages. Before Persephone could scream or run, he swept her into the chariot. The ancient texts describe her desperate struggle. She cried out for her mother, reached back toward the sunlight, fought against him. But Hades was a god of immense power, and the chariot was already plunging back down into the earth. The chasm closed behind them, leaving only disturbed earth and scattered flowers as evidence of what had happened. Her nymph companions rushed over moments too late, seeing nothing but the spot where their friend had vanished. The abduction was complete. When Persephone didn't return that evening, Demeter began to worry. When she didn't return by morning, Demeter began to panic. The goddess searched everywhere, calling her daughter's name across mountains, valleys, and seas. She questioned everyone, gods, mortals, nymphs, animals, but no one would tell her the truth. For 9 days and nights, Demeter wandered the earth without eating, sleeping, or tending to her divine duties. On the 10th day, Hecate, goddess of witchcraft and liminal spaces, revealed that she had heard Persephone's screams, but not seen who took her. Together, they went to Helios, the all-seeing sun god who witnessed everything under heaven. Helios finally told Demeter the truth. Hades had taken Persephone to be his queen, and Zeus himself had sanctioned it. Learning that her daughter had been stolen and taken to the realm of the dead, Demeter's grief transformed into rage. She abandoned her divine duties entirely and wandered the earth in disguise, refusing to allow anything to grow. The crops withered, the trees became barren, and humanity began to starve. This was the first winter the world had ever known. Zeus sent messenger gods to convince Demeter to return to Olympus and restore the harvest, but she refused every offer, every plea. Her demand was absolute: return Persephone, or the world would remain frozen and lifeless forever. The gods faced an existential crisis. If humans starved, who would worship them? Who would make sacrifices? Demeter had weaponized her grief, holding the entire cosmos hostage until her daughter was returned. Meanwhile, in the underworld, Persephone's experience was complex. Ancient texts offer varying accounts. Some portray her as a prisoner, locked in the palace, refusing food and weeping constantly for her mother and the lost sunlight. Others suggest she gradually adjusted, that Hades treated her with surprising gentleness and respect, giving her freedom to roam his realm, though not leave it. She discovered that the underworld, while dark, had its own strange beauty. Glowing crystals, underground rivers, gardens of precious metals in place of plants. Hades himself, while stern and absolute in his authority, showed her a side no other god had seen: his loneliness, his dedication to justice, his appreciation for her light in his darkness. The ancient writers understood something nuanced. Captivity and affection can coexist uncomfortably. The crisis reached its peak when Zeus finally sent Hermes to the underworld with a command: release Persephone. Hades unexpectedly agreed without argument. Ancient texts suggest he knew this confrontation was inevitable and had prepared for it. Before letting Persephone leave, he offered her a pomegranate, a fruit sacred to the underworld. In some versions, she was hungry after fasting and ate willingly. In others, she was tricked or didn't understand the significance. In still others, she ate knowingly, already having developed complex feelings about Hades and her role. She consumed 6 seeds. This simple act had cosmic consequences. In Greek belief, eating food in the underworld bound you to that realm. By consuming even a small portion, Persephone had tied herself to the land of the dead. When Persephone returned to the surface and reunited joyfully with Demeter, the truth about the pomegranate seeds emerged. Demeter was furious. Her daughter had been tricked into binding herself to Hades. But the laws of the universe were clear. Eating food in the underworld created an unbreakable connection. A great assembly of gods was called on Olympus to resolve the crisis. After much debate, Zeus proposed a compromise, which Hades accepted, surprisingly gracefully. Because Persephone had eaten only 6 seeds, not a full meal, she would not be bound to the underworld entirely. Instead, she would split her time. 6 months with Hades in the underworld, 6 months with Demeter on Olympus and Earth. This satisfied divine law while partially accommodating everyone's demands. The compromise had an unexpected effect on the mortal world. It created the seasons. When Persephone descended to the underworld to spend her 6 months as queen of the dead, Demeter would grieve and withdraw her blessings. Autumn would come, followed by winter. When Persephone returned to the surface, Demeter's joy would cause spring to bloom and summer to flourish. The Greeks had explained the agricultural cycle through divine family drama. But something else had happened too. Persephone was no longer the innocent maiden. She had become the Dread Queen, joint ruler of the underworld with Hades. Ancient texts describe her transformation. In the underworld, she wielded authority second only to Hades himself, judging souls and enforcing the laws of death with an iron will. The girl who gathered flowers had become the queen of the dead. One of Hades' most important characteristics was his unwavering sense of justice and fairness. Unlike Zeus, who could be swayed by beauty or flattery, or Poseidon, who acted on whims and temper, Hades was consistent and impartial. When souls arrived in his realm, they were judged based purely on their deeds in life. No exceptions for wealth, nobility, or divine parentage. Kings and beggars received equal treatment. This made Hades simultaneously feared and respected. You couldn't bribe death, couldn't charm it, couldn't negotiate with it. Mortals and gods alike knew that when they faced Hades, no argument would save them if their actions didn't justify it. This impartiality extended to his treatment of gods as well. Even Olympians who ventured into his realm had to follow his rules. Because Hades was so absolutely reliable and unchangeable, he became associated with the most sacred oaths. Greeks swore the most binding oaths by the river Styx, which flowed through Hades' realm. Breaking such an oath had severe consequences even for gods. They would be rendered temporarily powerless, unable to speak or move for a full year. This made Hades, by extension, the guarantor of all sacred promises. Business contracts, marriage vows, treaties between cities, all invoke the underworld's authority. This reveals something fascinating. Hades wasn't just about death. He represented permanence and unchangeable truth. In a world where gods constantly shifted allegiances and broke promises, Hades stood for absolute constancy. What happened in his realm stayed in his realm. What was sworn by his domain could not be undone. Less commonly known, Hades was also called Pluton, meaning wealthy or rich one, and was associated with the hidden riches of the earth. All precious metals, gems, and minerals came from his domain beneath the surface. This association made him a god of material wealth as well as death. Some ancient Greeks would pray to Pluton when seeking prosperity, carefully distinguishing this aspect from his role as death's ruler. This dual nature, death and wealth, actually makes philosophical sense. Both are about what's hidden, what's beneath the surface, what's permanent and unchanging, unlike crops which are seasonal and temporary. A buried treasure and a buried body occupy the same realm. This aspect of Hades appears in art, showing him holding a cornucopia, horn of plenty, alongside his more traditional symbols. Unlike other gods who constantly interfered in mortal affairs, Hades rarely left his kingdom. The few times he did venture to the surface world or Olympus were always for specific, significant reasons. One famous occasion was when he was shot by one of Heracles' arrows, poisoned with Hydra blood, and had to ascend to Olympus for healing from the physician god, Paeon. Another was during his abduction of Persephone. These rare appearances reinforced his mystique and authority. When Hades showed up, something momentous was happening. This restraint also demonstrated his commitment to duty. He understood that his realm required constant oversight, that death couldn't take vacations or neglect its responsibilities. His presence in the underworld was as necessary and constant as mortality itself. One of the most famous tests of Hades' authority came when the musician Orpheus descended to the underworld to retrieve his dead wife, Eurydice. Orpheus played his lyre so beautifully that he moved Hades and Persephone to tears, the first time anyone had ever managed to sway the god of death emotionally. Hades agreed to return Eurydice on one condition. Orpheus must walk out of the underworld with Eurydice following behind him, and he must not look back until they both reached the surface. If he looked back, she would return to death forever. This story reveals multiple layers of Hades' character. He could be moved by genuine love and artistry. He was willing to bend his absolute rules in exceptional circumstances, but his laws, once established, were inviolable. When Orpheus looked back, various versions differ on why. Eurydice vanished instantly, and Hades refused any second chance. Another famous incursion into the underworld was Heracles' 12th labor, to capture Cerberus and bring him to the surface. Interestingly, Heracles didn't sneak in or fight his way through. He asked Hades' permission. The Lord of the Dead agreed, but with a condition. Heracles must overpower Cerberus using only his strength, no weapons. This tells us something crucial about Hades. He respected protocol and fair play. Heracles succeeded, temporarily bringing Cerberus to the surface world, where the hound's appearance terrified everyone. Then, following Hades' stipulation, Heracles returned Cerberus to his post. Hades had maintained his authority while acknowledging exceptional heroism. The story became a template. You could petition Hades, he might even grant unusual requests, but his rules and sovereignty were non-negotiable. The relationship between Zeus and Hades was officially respectful but complex. Zeus ruled Olympus but couldn't override Hades' authority in the underworld. During the Persephone incident, Zeus facilitated the abduction, showing he trusted Hades despite the controversy. Throughout Greek myths, Zeus rarely interfered with underworld matters, and Hades rarely challenged Zeus's decisions. They maintained a professional distance, two powerful brothers who ruled separate domains with mutual respect but little warmth. Unlike Zeus's frequent conflicts with Poseidon, Hades avoided divine politics entirely, focusing solely on his realm. Poseidon and Hades had surprisingly little interaction despite being brothers. Their domains rarely overlapped. The sea and the underworld were separate realms. However, some ancient texts mention rivers flowing from the underworld into the ocean, creating a connection. Poseidon occasionally sent souls who drowned at sea to Hades' judgment. The two brothers maintained cordial relations, united more by their shared experience of being overshadowed by Zeus than by any close bond. Both preferred ruling their domains to engaging in Olympian politics. Hades didn't work alone. Thanatos, death personified, and Hypnos, sleep, were his primary agents who actually collected souls. Thanatos was a winged god who appeared at the moment of death to separate soul from body, while Hypnos brought rest and dreams. These weren't Hades' servants, but rather independent forces who operated within his realm. Hades was the administrator and judge, while Thanatos was the executor. This distinction shows the Greeks understood death as a process, not a single moment. Hades represented the destination and governance, while Thanatos represented the transition itself. Hecate, goddess of magic, crossroads, and liminal spaces, had a special relationship with Hades and Persephone. She witnessed Persephone's abduction and became Persephone's companion in the underworld, helping guide lost souls and holding torches at the boundaries between worlds. Hecate was one of the few deities who could freely move between the living world and the underworld, making her invaluable to Hades. She represented the thresholds and transitions that Hades' realm required. Neither fully of death nor fully of life, she existed in between, just as Persephone would eventually embody. One of Hades' most famous dealings involved Sisyphus, the craftiest of mortals. Sisyphus cheated death twice, first by chaining Thanatos so no one could die, then by tricking Persephone into letting him return to the living world. When he finally died permanently, Hades personally designed his punishment, eternally rolling a boulder up a hill, only to have it roll back down just before reaching the top. This wasn't random cruelty, but symbolic justice. Sisyphus, who tried to escape death's finality, would experience endless, meaningless repetition. The punishment fit the crime perfectly, showing Hades' sophisticated understanding of justice. Throughout all these myths, a consistent picture emerges. Hades is stern, inflexible, and absolute, but not evil. He never betrays agreements, never punishes without cause, and maintains order in a realm that could easily descend into chaos. Unlike gods who act on whims, Hades follows cosmic law. He's the god who does the necessary but unpleasant job that keeps reality functioning. The Greeks feared him not because he was cruel, but because he was inevitable and impartial. You couldn't charm death, bribe it, or escape it. This made Hades simultaneously the most frightening and most honest of the gods. Hades' influence on Greek culture was profound. His realm explained death's mystery and gave structure to the afterlife. His association with oaths made contracts and promises meaningful. His fairness demonstrated that even death operates under rules and justice. Greek religion required Hades. Without him, death would be random chaos rather than ordered transition. He represented uncomfortable truths, that all mortals die, that death is impartial, that what's done cannot be undone. Every funeral, every oath, every acceptance of mortality was an acknowledgement of Hades' authority. He was perhaps the most essential god precisely because his domain was universal and inescapable. Modern portrayals often villainize Hades, conflating him with Satan or depicting his realm as hell. But the Greek underworld wasn't primarily about punishment. It was about final rest and transition. Hades wasn't a tempter or corrupter, but an administrator. This fundamental misunderstanding erases the sophisticated Greek view of death as natural and necessary rather than evil. The original Hades was complex, capable of love, Persephone, bound by law, lonely but dignified, powerful but restrained. He wasn't an enemy of life, but its inevitable conclusion. And that conclusion wasn't torture, but rather fading into eternal rest for most souls. Hades remains in his realm even now in Greek mythology, eternally performing his duties. Unlike Zeus, who appears in countless adventures, or Poseidon with his many conflicts, Hades' story is one of consistency and duty. He is where he has always been, in the palace beneath the earth, judging the dead, maintaining cosmic order, sharing half the year with his queen Persephone. His story teaches that true power isn't about glory or attention, but about fulfilling necessary roles that others cannot or will not. He is the god who accepted the hardest job and performed it perfectly for eternity, never seeking praise, never abandoning his post, forever the guardian of death's door. Understanding Hades means understanding how the ancient Greeks faced mortality. They didn't deny death or make it evil. They gave it structure, rules, and dignity. Hades embodied their acceptance that death is universal, impartial, and final. His realm wasn't meant to comfort but to acknowledge reality. Perhaps that's why he remains fascinating. In a mythology full of gods who behave like flawed humans, Hades alone is absolutely consistent, following laws even he cannot break. He is what death must be, inevitable, impartial, and ultimately necessary for life to have meaning. The Lord of the Underworld wasn't life's enemy, but rather its defining boundary, the period at the end of every sentence that gives meaning to what came before. So there you have it. The complete story of Hades, Lord of the Underworld, not a devil, not evil, but the stern and fair custodian of death itself. From his dark beginnings, swallowed by his father, through the cosmic war for reality, to his eternal duty judging souls and maintaining order in the realm beneath the earth. He's the god who accepted the hardest job in the cosmos and performed it with absolute consistency for all eternity. The next time you hear the name Hades, remember, he's not the villain of Greek mythology. He's its most misunderstood necessity.